Welcome to the Assured Support Nordic Coronavirus Bunker. I appreciate it. It's now March and it's only the first of the Assured Support webinars for 2021. We have not been idle. There has been a lot going on. We're very busy. And as you can see from the planner on our website, there's a whole range of regulatory activity barreling down the pipeline towards us. And we've also got some issues in terms of, even dealing with what we've got at the moment. So what we intend to do today is to run through the breach regime. There's some detail in. There's been a lot of apprehension about the breach regime, how it works, how it's going to fit together. Hopefully we'll tease out and we'll address some of those issues today. Now, if you're wondering who I am, I'm Sean Graham. I'm the Managing Director of Assured Support. With me is Victoria Whitty, who is the Head of Advice Governance at Easton Wealth. And Easton Wealth includes GPS, Merit, and Paragem. And Victoria's here to bring a practical operational side to some of the things we're going to talk about today. Because there has been a lot of debate in the media, hasn't there, particularly about the regulatory Armageddon that's facing us.
Yes, I think there's been a lot of discussion around this breach reporting regime and that there's going to be a huge number of breaches to report. But what we really wanted to do today was just to sort of go through the legal and the practical aspects of it. We at Easton Wealth have started to look at what additional procedures that we need in place to make sure that we're ready for the new breach reporting regime, because there are some changes from a legal and technical perspective, which we'll go through with you. There's also quite a few grey areas as well, so we'll touch on those grey areas and we'll look at sort of how we're approaching them from that side as well, because I think every licensee will approach them slightly differently with those nuances.
And I can't guarantee we're going to give you absolute clarity, but at least we'll go through them in a practical and a commercial perspective as well. So that's the intention for today. We're going to run through it very much from a licensee perspective and very much from a commercial perspective. So before we kick off running through the detail, just some housekeeping issues. One, this is a webinar, right? So we're subject to the whims and whimsy of the NBN and Zoom. So if the screen stalls, don't get frustrated, don't shout at your monitor, don't kick the cat. We will send the pack out to you at completion of the meeting anyway, and they'll have all the hyperlinks and all the additional material that's in that as well. So again, don't do it. It's probably obvious to you all as well is that we're not going to be giving you specific tax advice, financial advice, legal advice, career counselling, or any type of home renovation tips. We're just going to deal with this at a practical and operational level. So, and we're not suggesting for a moment we've got all the answers. Tori's implementing it in her business across 3 licenses. We're dealing with a lot of clients who are managing these and approaching the new requirements in a realistic fashion. So I might have come across as a bit flippant before when I suggested it's not going to be regulatory Armageddon. I don't think it is going to be, and I think hopefully at the end of the session you'll come across to the view that we both share, which there are refinements in some grey areas, but it's quite a positive one. The third part of this is that if you have questions, submit them through the chat. Ideally, we'd love to do live questions and whatever else, but I'm always worried about webinars and the capacity for the NBN to actually handle the workload. So again, send through the chat and ask any questions you might have.
And just further to that, if you've got any questions at the end, please send them through to Sean, and even if they're practical questions as well, send them through and we'll look to answer them as quickly as possible.
Yep. And so we're going to presume a level of knowledge here today as well. We're going to presume that most people actually know what we're talking about when we talk about breaches and how it all fits together and all those aspects. So if there are some fundamental questions, don't be afraid to ask them. We're quite happy to go through those questions as we go. And again, you can always ask, but otherwise, please keep it on mute so that we can just get through it. So when we talk about these issues today, one of the things I do want to emphasise is we're going to be taking a practical approach. So when I say practical, we've looked at over 11,000 files, and that seems a lot by any stretch of the imagination. Because we're a data-driven company as well, we tend to not only look at the files, but really analyse the data as to what they mean, what they indicate. You try to draw lead and lag indicators from the data. So when I talk about, well, what's happening in the industry, it's based on fact, not based on apprehensions about what's going to happen and how it's all going to fall apart. So again, practical, commercial, and we'll go through. And one of the first questions we get with breach reporting, particularly this issue, is, why do we have to go through this? I mean, we've had enough best interest, we've had Royal Commission, had a range of things. Why do we need enhanced breach reporting?
When we already have it in place.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's quite an interesting one, Sean. ASIC did a review around breach reporting a couple of years back, and they actually found that it was taking licensees a very long time to report on breaches. In fact, in one instance, it took 1,849 days, which is a little over 5 years, just to report one breach, when the current reporting requirements are 10 business days.
Yeah. And I personally don't know many licensees that have gone over 1,700 days as a matter of course. I mean, 849 days is a regulatory threshold that I dare say we'll never see again. And it does show, I mean, one of the realities to everyone on this session is that there is a difference in the way that licensees might be treated. Insofar as small licensees and medium-sized licensees couldn't possibly have allowed something to go to 849 days. They wouldn't have the resources, they wouldn't have the chutzpah to give it a go. But you can see why Commissioner Hayne was so determined that there should be some reform here.
Yeah.
Because regulatory breach reporting, according to the explanatory memorandum, is the foundation of an effective regulatory regime. So it's one of the underlying principles that need to be addressed.
So what Commissioner Hayne effectively did was he tried to put some more rules in place to make it a little bit more black and white, to make sure that licensees are reporting these breaches in a timely manner.
So let's get into it, and let's just, the devil is in the details, so let's go through them. Do you want to run through the main changes?
Yeah, sure. So currently we have one significance test, and that's now been expanded to 2, which we'll go through. They've also extended the definition of reportable situations to explain when something is reportable and to give more context to it. But one of the positives that they did was that they actually increased the time to report on breaches. Currently we have 10 business days to do so, but they found through their reviews that our licensees were effectively taking a lot longer to report on those. So they decided to change that to 30 calendar days, which is more realistic. And I think it also helps. I mean, it's very difficult when you're working out what state has what holiday as to when to report something. So the 30 calendar days makes it much easier. The other changes were that there's now almost like a dobbing provision where you need to report in other licensees if you do see a breach. And lastly, and quite interestingly, through the Hayne Royal Commission, one of the recommendations was that they did publish data around the breaches for licensees. So each licensee will have the number of breaches reported through in a report to ASIC. And again, actually, I find that quite interesting as well, because if you've got great monitoring and supervision in place, Sean, it means that your licensee is going to have more breaches.
That's true. This is, President Trump ran that argument so successfully in the US as well. The more effective your monitoring and supervision is, you're going to identify issues that are going to be reported, so you're going to see. But also, the larger the licensee, the more issues you're going to have as well. So the alternative is what? That you do less monitoring and supervision, so you don't identify issues, so you don't report them. And essentially, all you're doing is those issues are bubbling away. And remember, your peers now have an obligation to report it. So there are some interesting things here. I mean, they've gone to 30 calendar days. Again, that's really positive. I imagine if the institutional licensees were still in the market, they would have been arguing for an order of magnitude higher, like 300 days or more, because 10 days is really hard to identify an issue, manage it, report it, and particularly in a large organisation to escalate it through the various levels of management. So that's a good thing. The obligation to report others' breaches. When I was a kid in Mad Magazine, they used to have something called Spy versus Spy, which is to show the two spies, tit for tat engagement, when they mutually just a short destruction every time. I do worry that the obligation to report others' breaches, because we've got to notify the regulator and the other licensee, might get a bit messy from that perspective if people don't embrace a level of not only transparency but good faith from that perspective. I'm really keen about that, the data on breach reports. I mean, obviously we have a lot of data over a number of years, so it'd be interesting to see whether or not the data that goes to ASIC and that ASIC report matches where we think it's going and what's happening in the industry.
Technically, how many breaches do you tend to see when you're looking at
Well, again, I mean, it's a licensee's determination if it's a breach, but when I look at contravention, if I look at the numbers of contraventions per file review, what we have seen is since about 2018 was a bad year. I mean, it was the Dover exodus and there were a number of other bits and pieces that flowed through. But in 2019 and 2020, the number of significant contraventions, so legislative or statutory or regulatory contraventions, has decreased significantly. So what that says to me, and I have to be clear, is that we look after 120 licensees, but I can't say we look after the entire industry. So our clients might be unrepresentative of the industry as a whole. They might be much better from that perspective. But based on our data, advisors have been getting progressively better. Even as FASEA started to bite last year, and they're starting to do that, they're still improving and finding, experiencing those contraventions. So I'm quite positive about that. I think we're heading in the right direction as an industry to be able to improve. But I do appreciate that a lot of licensees are worried about suddenly being exposed, about there being a website that people check me out and see I'm not as good as I thought I was, or that worse still, one of my competitors is better.
Yes.
Without the worst thing in the world. So the thing that I want to emphasise to you, and if you're running a licensee, if you're in a licensee, if you're an advisor, is that every business that we go into, every advisor we see has issues. They might not be significant issues. There's always something. I mean, financial services laws is very complex. It's highly regulated, frequently changes. It's really difficult to give advice in a compliant fashion, run a compliant business. It's challenging, and that's why the better businesses have invested in people and systems and doing all those things over a period of time. So,
and I think the regulator sees that businesses aren't perfect, and they will expect to see some breaches coming through from the licensee. Just wanted to also add that these new changes don't just affect AFSLs, but it also affects credit AFSLs as well. So this is the first time that it's come into effect. So if you've got a credit AFSL, you need to make sure that you're abiding by these as well.
So, some of these reforms will make it, I know we talk about these regulatory reforms generating more work for the lawyers and the compliance people, but think about it this way: if you've got an ACL and an AFSL, suddenly you only have to have one breach management process, one consequence management process. Win-win-win. How's that for a great outcome? But let's be serious and let's get through one of the interesting parts of the new regime, which is the idea of reportable situations, which the law requires licensees to escalate to ASIC, to notify ASIC of failures which are reportable situations, and they've very conveniently given definitions. So shall we run through this?
Yeah, of course. So the first one is where a licensee or a representative has breached a core obligation. So the core obligations are ones such as your efficiency, honestly and fairly obligation, and you need to also determine whether that breach is significant or not.
So if you think about your 912A, your core obligations, we've got to be adequately resourced. We've got to have an IDR, we've got to have an EDR process. We've got to monitor and train our representatives. We've got to ensure they're competent. Heaven forbid. We've got to have efficient, honestly and fairly. All those things that when you're running a good business, you're doing anyway, right? So don't be worried that this is suddenly a new thing. What we did see out of the Royal Commission were a lot of the organisations, larger licensees, which sort of just glossed over that obligation to act efficiently, honestly and fairly. And so what this is doing is it's dragging them back and saying, no, that is a fundamental principle. It's a core obligation. If you can't get that right, there's a problem. But again, one of the parts here is you've got a core obligation and the breach is significant. So significance is still there. There's still a degree of room for licensees to look at these things. So it's not as binary as you might have read in the press, that some of these things somehow all have to be escalated and reported. The other part is when, you know, your licensee or rep is no longer able to comply. So prospective things, you think it's going to happen, and if it does happen, it's going to be significant. So you can see the first one's looking at something that has happened, but there is an obligation and expectation that licensees should be looking forward, as we all do, you know, look forward to seeing what's likely to happen. In the same way, we're expecting advisors to do that with their clients with the new fee disclosure requirements to talk about fees going forward and services in the future. There's a degree of licensee operation which has to be reflective but has to be prospective as well. And that prospective view has to look at how your business operates and how it meets the obligations going forward.
The next one is around investigation. So if you find a breach, but you're not 100% sure whether it's a breach or not, because you need to look into it a little bit further. And if you take more than 30 days to look into that particular breach, you need to report it through to ASIC, regardless of whether it's a breach or not. And what's quite interesting about this is if you find out 40 days later that it definitely isn't a breach, but you've reported as a breach, you need to go back to ASIC and let them know that it wasn't a breach. So there's a lot more reporting around that as well. Interestingly, they've brought in the term investigation, but investigation isn't an actual term within the Corps Act. So it really depends on what a licensee's opinion is on an investigation and how they define that. And every licensee will have a different opinion on what an investigation is and when it does start and commence.
So the explanatory memorandum has addressed that to a point. So it said, look, if you're putting stuff in a register or recording it, that's not an investigation, right? So we're going to take a common sense commercial view of things. But if you get advice on something, if you do a subsequent review, if you call for more files, if you look at those things, then logically there's an investigation going on. And I don't think this is such a bad thing. I think this is another aspect which seems bureaucratic and difficult, but actually is quite liberating, because a lot of compliance people in larger organisations struggle to get, you know, breaches reported through the regulator because they're either line management gets in the way, or internal lawyers, or the risk management division. Everyone's got a reason that it doesn't go through, but it's essentially the compliance manager, the responsible manager, who's going to wear it at the end. So it's great that it's giving RMs and compliance managers a bit of cover from that perspective.
And it's quite interesting that they've put this timeline around investigations, because if you look at some of the big banks, they would sit on breaches and they'd say, we're still investigating to see whether it's actually a reportable breach or not, and they would take months and months to come to a conclusion. So what ASIC's basically said is that you can't do that anymore. You need to get in there, do your review, get it done quickly and make that determination.
And again, we saw that through when the Royal Commission looked at claims handling as well, their willingness for licensees to drag things out until the issue resolved itself. We don't have to act efficient on some fairly, so we need to do it. One of the elements now is you've got an obligation to report situations which relate to conduct that constitutes gross negligence. And that's great. It's even in bold, so it's so important. But what's gross negligence?
Well, it's interesting in terms of what the definition of gross negligence is, because the term doesn't actually have a precise meaning, but it's actually ascertained from context. So it depends on, you know, was the negligence something that was by accident, or was that negligence intentional?
Yeah, and the impact. So what we've referenced here is the particular case that addresses the issue in a different context. But again, in this case, I mean, Justice Paul went through and looked at it and said, look, negligence is not just an act of omission, right? That's negligence. So failure to exercise due care and diligence, failure to meet reasonable standards of professional skill. It becomes gross negligence if you knew that you hadn't met that standard, whether you're reckless towards it or whether you just didn't care from those types of things. So again, we're not here to give you legal advice for all those bits and pieces, but it's something broader than just, you know, a failure. And one of the challenges I think you've got here when you're operationalising this, and I'm interested to see how you're doing it, is that a lot of the stuff we're going to be dealing with now are legal principles like investigation, that are put into the guides and the explanatory memorandum and the draft regulations without an explanation. So practically, how do you make sure they're operationalised effectively in your business?
Well, I think, Sean, it's about having your own definitions for what an investigation is, what gross fraud means, and having justification for that. I think everyone has a slightly different nuanced opinion, but it's also about speaking to your lawyer, making sure that you've got that down pat, so that when you do come across instances, you can refer back to those definitions.
So is that in like your consequence management or your risk appetite statement, things like that, your compliance plan? But the other side of it is like, then, okay, you've documented it at a licensee level, you've put the framework in place. Operationalising means that not just writing it down, but people are actually doing it. So what additional steps do you do to make sure that the people you've got in your business can actually recognise gross negligence if it isn't over there?
Well, it's about making sure that they're adequately trained to do so, and that you give them the training around it so that they can identify such instances. It's also about having a culture of transparency within your business, so that, if you do come across something and you're not quite sure, you can take that to your direct manager. You can discuss that internally as a group so that you really come up with the right outcome there.
And the last point is this serious fraud. I'm not suggesting there for a moment that, insignificant frauds are okay, or that minor frauds or trivial frauds, or that there is any such characteristic. But what they're trying to differentiate here is between the frauds based on the impact. And the difficulty with trying to assess the impact of fraud is that it's very difficult to assess. And unfortunately, they've been a bit more legalistic here, because what they've done is they've tied it back to the consequences. Okay, so what they're suggesting, if it's a fraud that involves dishonesty or whatever, that if it's punishable with a custodial sentence, then that's something that's likely to be reported to ASIC. When we talk about those fraud, we're talking about penalties of custodial sentences of 3 months or more, and for other types of misconduct, 12 months or more. So again, the point I made with Tori earlier is about these changes require a real investment in the competence and capability of your compliance people. In the same way that APRA was pushing CP 535 through and talking about the competence and capability and courage of your compliance people as licensees, that's something that you need to do. And the better licensees have been doing that for a while, really investing in having the right people and making sure that the right people have the resources and the influence to be able to do this type of stuff. So don't underestimate that. The process piece is important. But again, licensees or groups like Easton have been dealing with this for a long period of time, seeing what was coming down the road and making sure they're ready for it. And I think a lot of licensees have been doing the same thing. If you haven't started that journey now, have a real think about the capability, including the education and experience of the people who are going to be implementing these requirements for you.
I think, interestingly, you don't want your compliance staff just reporting things willy-nilly that aren't significant as well, because you could have that instance as well where things are being reported that don't effectively need to be reported. Yeah,
that's a real challenge. Is that will too little be reported or too much? And I'm not worried there's going to be too much reporting. I might be very surprised towards down the path. But I think most licensees will grapple with these and they'll struggle with the same things. But I don't think they're as necessarily difficult. This is the old test of significance, which we'll just run through this really quickly. So if you look at your incident management policy and you look at your processes around that, whenever you identified an issue which might potentially be a breach, you'd run through this series of qualifications to decide whether it was notifiable. And so you look at the number and frequency of similar breaches, and this is where data is so valuable to be able to go, it was the same thing that happened 2 years ago, or it's different to that one that happened last month because of these reasons. The impact on the licensee's ability to provide financial services or credit activities, and that's pretty obvious. Isn't it? I mean, it's much more we need to talk about there. That third point is something that I think a lot of organisations overlook, particularly when breaches are identified through complaints or by external parties brought to attention elsewhere is.
Yes, because typically you need to make sure that you do have the right compliance framework in place, that your files are being audited regularly, so that you can identify these instances. Your practice development manager is across everything that's happening within the business, because you obviously don't want those compliance issues to be raised through complaints or other external cases.
And the actual potential loss of clients. Look, we'll talk about this when we get to materiality, because I think it's fundamental. But again, don't be too black and white about actual potential losses. Don't necessarily limit to purely financial losses either, and don't see them in isolation. So that'll be the kick there. And that's what we've all been doing, right? That's traditional model. This is a new model, and they've introduced the concept of deemed significance. So do you want to run us through that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there are a number of reasons as to why something would be deemed significant. So whether it's a contravention of a civil penalty as an example, and we'll run through some of those civil penalties. A civil penalty is where you've breached something such as your best interest duty requirements. But if it's something to do with some typos in your FDS, that would essentially be reportable. So civil penalties really just depend on the certain circumstances. It's also a contravention if there's a material loss or damage to a retail client. So we'll just briefly talk about what a material loss or damage is. So it really, again, is quite grey, because it really depends on the circumstances. So someone, for example, who loses $5,000 from poor advice, as an example, that may not be significant to them. They might be quite well off, and they won't miss that money. But someone who only has $40,000 in the bank and they've lost $5,000, that would be considered a material loss to them.
Yeah. And I think one of the things to bear in mind, and again, we saw this example in the way that the CEO of Commonwealth Bank addressed complaints initially before the Royal Commission, because it was asked about, has CBA provision for all these complaints against advisors? And he said, we haven't provisioned for them because they're not material. And the issue there was might not be material for the group themselves, but certainly material to the consumers who were impacted, and it came across as being callous and indifferent to the client. So when you're looking at those types of things, bear in mind you've got to consider their relevant personal circumstances when you're looking at that issue of materiality, and you've got to put it in context. So $100 loss for a client is probably not material, but if there's 1 million clients that have been impacted, yes, it is material. It's got to be done there. Tori introduced a couple of things there that are really interesting. So when we talk about likely to result in material loss or damage, the common law position is it's got to be reasonably likely, not remote. So there's not 1 in 100,000 chance that they might suffer loss. It's got to be reasonably likely. Okay, so you've got to be satisfied that on balance of probabilities, it might happen. And so this is when we talked about before about the capabilities, your staff, your education, the systems, your risk framework, and your governance structure. It's about, acknowledging the level of discretion and giving parameters to the relevant people so they can make those decisions in a reasonable manner. Okay.
And so when you look at the reporting requirements, you need to report within 10 business days. Now, you may not have paid back any of your clients from a remediation perspective, but if it's likely that you will be paying them back and it is a material loss or damage and likely to be, then that is reportable. The other two areas are if you've got any misleading or deceptive conduct occurring, of course that would be deemed significant, as well as if there's an offence punishable by a sentence of 12 months or more. So where you're essentially sent to jail.
So the civil penalty provisions, like I said earlier, when we were discussing this over the past couple of days, there's been a lot of apprehension, a bit of fear-mongering in the industry about, we're going to grind to a halt with all these reporting, it's going to destroy the industry, financial planning, reach your own again. I never thought that was going to be the case. What came out last night, which was really good timing for this session, was the draft regulations. And the draft regulations go through and say, look, There are a lot of things that are civil penalties. Here's what we're not worried about. We're not worried about FSGs. We're not worried about minor mistakes of that fashion. What they are worried about is not just the civil penalty provisions outlined in 1317G, but there's a whole range of them. And so you go through, so you've got your core licence obligations, 912A, civil penalty provision, that aren't in Schedule 3, right? So they're not listed there, which means that they're subject to the new penalties that came out last year, the year before 2019. So, okay, so in those ones, and we'll forget about the pecuniary penalties and the custodial sentencing, but if you just look at the civil penalties, what that means is that for a contravention of a civil penalty provision, the maximum fine can be 5,000 penalty units. And a penalty unit, as everyone knows, is $222. So 5,000 times $222 is a lot of money. And if it's a corporate, it's 10 times as much. Okay, so there are a lot of penalties there. So if you look at the ones that have civil penalty provisions which are subject to that, your core licence obligations, of course, your breach reporting, SOA production, which is really covered under Section 1317 anyway, defective disclosure documents, the SOA and the FSG. So they'll drag in some of the 947D, but remember there is a defence of reasonableness and reasonable steps that you've taken to protect you, reasonable disclosure. The core elements though, there are 4 elements that you really need to focus on when you talk about this, because this is what I suspect ASIC is really worried about. What are we talking about? We're talking about 961B, which is your best interest obligation. We're talking about appropriateness, which is 961G for those of you playing at home. 961H, which is, everyone knows, your obligation to all clients when you're relying on incomplete or inaccurate information. And, the cherry on the cake, which is 961J, which is, of course, your obligation to prioritise clients' interests. So they're the core elements, and they're the core ethical obligations, which are reinforced by your FSC obligations anyway. So,
but I did hear one that was quite interesting, Sean, that if you have a breach and you forget to report it, and then you realise that you do need to report it, you also need to report that you didn't report the breach on time.
Right. And that failure to report that breach that you failed to report is in fact a breach.
Yeah.
So we can have this virtuous circle of breach reporting coming from the first thing. So, a poorly run business could just spend all its time reporting the initial breach until retirement.
I think from a practical operational perspective, I think it's really good that your staff understand what all those civil penalties are and that you have a list of them so that you can go back and refer to them. Going back to the Court Act every time to work out whether something's a civil penalty or not probably isn't an efficient or effective way to use your time. So just getting an understanding of what they are beforehand, I think.
So one of the articles that will come out on Tuesday next week will run you through those civil penalty provisions. And what you'll see in the next couple of weeks is we're building a tool to guide people through that assessment process of I've had an incident. Is it a breach for a start? What type of breach is it? And what do I need to do to work through that decision? And that will be on our website under the tools and templates tab at the bottom of the website. It's not there yet, but it'll come up in the next couple of weeks. So let's just kick ahead to the civil penalty regime. And I read ahead, I read through those. That's the basic list of those types of things. So your disclosure requirements, like I said, they're not worried about the technical stuff. Your FSD's got a mistake, or the logo of the practice is large and none of the licensee. They're not worried about the trivial stuff. I mean, let's give the regulator and Treasury some credit. They want to focus on the things that are fundamental to the professionalism of advice. Okay, and that's what we're all interested in doing. So we want to make sure that licensees are operating properly, they're appropriately resourced, they're led by right people, they're competent and capable to provide the services, that they're escalating issues when they occur and dealing with them appropriately, and that advisors are doing what's required. And when we talk about disclosure requirements, when we're talking about, really onerous requirements, we're talking about quite basic compliance obligations, which admittedly were made harder than they need to be, but we'll deal with those. The last 2 points there, one of those are the credit licensees. As Tori said before, credit licensees are subject to the same requirements now, so they're dragged into it, which is great. And that duty to act in utmost good faith and provide key fact sheets, that's really for insurers, but it's there as well to just go through. And again, when you get the PDF session notes sent out to you, all those hyperlinks will be there, so you'll be able to go through them at your own leisure and see what it's all about. This is the good news. We should always lead with the good news. We should have this at the right to front. So 30 calendar days. So that means, it doesn't mean that you can put your feet up and relax every time a breach hits your inbox. But it does give you more time, because I know in my experience it is sometimes incredibly difficult to get things through in 10 days. So 30 calendar days is a really practical and effective way to deal with it.
And all of those get reported through the ASIC website, so it's no longer paper-based. It hasn't been paper-based for a while, but that reporting will still continue to go through electronically.
And what do you think about the regulatory portal for breach reporting?
Well, I had a look at it the other day, Sean, and it's still quite cumbersome. There's quite a lot of questions to answer there. So it's not just about the breach itself, but it's what you as a licensee are doing to make sure that you don't have another breach like that again. So there's a bit to it. It'll be interesting to see whether ASIC decides to simplify that reporting system or not. They haven't come out and said anything about that yet, but something that we're looking at.
It's interesting because the system already allows for voluntary notifications, which is interesting, but they still require a lot of information from that perspective. And they also ask about what have you done? Have you notified clients what you've done with them? So they seem to have at least one eye to the future when they do that, but it is very cumbersome from that perspective. But this is an interesting part, I think, is your obligation to notify clients about issues. And not to suggest that it's more appropriate to keep clients in the dark and not tell anybody, but let's just run through this and let's see if there are any things we need to worry about as a licensee.
So I know, Sean, at our licensee Easton, we do make sure that if a client is impacted, we do let them know about that impact and talk them through the process. I think this is sort of almost taking it to another step, whereas if you have a breach, you definitely need to make sure that you report it through to your client.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with some of those ones, because you look at the definition, we're talking about breach of core obligations, gross negligence, serious fraud, that affected clients and have suffered or will suffer loss or damage, right? It's vague about what's loss or damage or whatever, but we can all, okay, something's happened, you're going to lose money, it's our fault for whatever reason. It's that last point down here that this legally enforceable right? So, you know, if we make the determination, if your compliance people or whatever make a determination that there's a legally enforceable right, then you should pay them out. And again, it comes down to, I know you've invested in training and systems and all those things, but your obligation to ensure that people are trained and competent to be able to identify a legally enforceable right. And given, we've seen numerous examples from larger licensees where they couldn't even identify a breach. So to get down to this point, it's asking a lot. And again, it's the smaller, the independent licensees which are now bearing the burden of the legacy of the larger institutional groups. And it's just, regardless of where you are on that spectrum, it's going to be a challenge for everyone. Whatever we can do to help you would be really good. The remediation point, I mean, we're probably all sick to death of remediation after billions of dollars. But
yes, but essentially they've put some new requirements around remediating clients. So you now need to have them remediated within 30 days. And you need to notify clients within 10 days. So I can see from a small business that could have impacts if you're trying to make sure that you're meeting all your other requirements, ongoing advice obligations, for example. But it's really about making sure that you do have that in place. I know at Easton we have in our policy already that all clients must be remediated within 30 business days, and we have processes in place to make sure that occurs.
So there are a couple of things that just trigger in my mind when we look at that. It's one is, okay, the impact on cash flow for a licensee, a smaller licensee, to remediate straight away and then recover somewhere down the track. Particularly depending on your RG166 calculations and how that's based. So you might want to all go back and have a look at how you assess and measure your capital adequacy, because you can imagine that, you know, if you do an investigation and you find types of things like this, it might eat into your contingency funds or the level of capital you're required to maintain your license, which again, might trigger a core obligation failure and an obligation breach. So bear that in mind. The other part, which is really apart from the time frame, and I think 30 days, remediating losses within 30 days might be tough, particularly if you means you can't rely on deeds of agreement, deeds of settlement to get in the money. But I wonder how it's going to impact on PI for licensees. So we don't have a compensation scheme of last resort. So we're all required to, if we're dealing with red light rights, we have to have PI. Is this, I mean, do you want to, guess about the future as to where it's going to go, whether PI is going to go up or down or sideways or stay the same?
Well, essentially, this is just putting some new measures around remediating clients. So from a cost perspective, I don't see it would have any real impact because you'd essentially be remediating anyway. It just means that you might be doing it in a shorter time frame, which could be a positive in an effect as well, because you need to make sure that you put the client back into the position they should have been in before.
Yeah.
So the calculation that you're doing around that client will probably be less if you get in there and get it done straight away. And
this comes down to, I mean, Tori just introduced a really good point about when you're calculating the loss. It's not just, my excess is 10 grand, so I'll pay out 10 grand and whatever else. You're really going to have to look at calculating that loss appropriately and reasonably, and in a way that stands up to external validation. And in some cases, you might actually get that calculation done externally to give that objective. Yeah.
Definitely, or you might have some spreadsheets that you've already had approved that you can use each time you need to remediate clients, and that just gets it done in a more quicker, efficient manner.
Yeah. I mean, it's just people, process, purpose. You keep those three things in mind, you won't find these things too difficult, but it is an investment. And that compensation, like I said, it's great. It's great that it's not going to be dragged out for a long period of time and whatever else, but you've got to pay the amount equal to the loss of damage. So we've got to be really careful about how we calculate that and so that it's reasonable. And also the other part of it is that if I settle with Tori, for example, and I pay her, I've detected misconduct, I've got to fix it. Tori suffered a loss of $50,000, I pay her up $50,000. There is nothing that stops her then pursuing her rights elsewhere. Going to AFCA, going to court, doing any of those bits and pieces. And it's not quite double jeopardy, but it is a potential risk. What I'll say to you is that it's unlikely that the courts will ignore the settlement and the reasonable steps that you've taken. So I know that doesn't give you certainty. It's hardly making you bulletproof, but it should reduce some of that apprehension about the future. Okay, act appropriately, do things reasonably, and put clients back in the position they would have been but for the act or omission, and you're going to be protected from that perspective. So let's just, anything you want to add to compensation? No?
No, I think you've covered all the key spots.
Now we're getting into the troublesome area, which is the part that I think is really, I think it's great. I think it is a great idea. I do worry about voluntary notifications.
Yes.
And I suspect there are people on the line who are a bit worried about this. So I'll just explain what I'm talking about, and then give Tori the right to the ability to coax me down back from the edge or the ledge or whatever it is. But all this is saying is that external parties, advisors, licensees, have an obligation consistent with your FSERA obligation, consistent with your OFBA obligation to escalate issues, to raise issues, not just note them, not just leave it for somebody else's professional association, somebody else, but to raise it with ASIC. I do not have a concern with that. I think that's a really good thing, and I think good licensees have been doing it for a long period of time, notwithstanding the fact that ASIC aren't always forthright, responsive, or open about the consequences of those things. So I understand that. The thing that worries me, and it's this reciprocity thing, which is that if I tell you, because I have to tell you, I can't go to ASIC, I'm telling you I'm going to go to ASIC and tell them that you're not running your business properly for this reason. I don't think I'm generally going to be, appreciated, welcomed, respected, and I'm worried that then it might just lead to an escalation. And I also worry that why would it have been more effective to say that you know, I have to give you 7 days notice before I raise it with the regulator, because it's very hard. I mean, I could see one incident, and how do I get to that one incident to be satisfied that it's a core obligation or it's a significant loss or significant damage?
And how do you have enough context to know that? So I think there could be some examples where it is easy to figure out someone who's acting, pretending to be an advisor when they're not, the Melissa Bannick case.
Yeah.
That would be an easy one, but others I think would be harder to
Those
identify.
obvious things. But even in the examples before that I've dealt with, one of the difficulties you often find is that they seem clear cut. You know, the money's not missing or whatever. But often clients don't want to complain, or they don't want to do something. They don't want to cause the person trouble because they're a nice guy, and it's a real challenge. And we just did an article on such a nice guy on fraud and financial services, and it's a real challenge. So it's going to be difficult to manage it from that perspective, to deal with that on a professional level in a way that's going to work effectively, and not be worried about consequences. And as you know, you've got a defence of qualified privilege, and I've linked it to the law there, which protects you if you engage in good faith reporting, right? So from defamation.
But I think there could also be a bit of tit for tat going on as well here.
Well, I think about this. So, for example, say you're dealing with a platform, and the platform provider their systems are so bad that they're breaching the Privacy Act or something else. You raise it with them, they don't do anything. You raise it with the regulator. Okay, you tell them I'm raising it with the regulator. How is it going to impact the commercial relationship you have with that group? Is it going to be, that's okay, look, you know, we didn't mind it, our senior managers have been banned from the industry, but so it's all good, we love you. And that's the challenge that's going to come down. And I think it's going to be really interesting. The good businesses will drive this, and they'll do the right thing, but we have to make sure that we stand with them to make sure they can't be bullied by some of the groups that aren't as interested in doing the right thing.
I'll be interested to see what reporting comes out from ASIC around this, through their reporting requirements.
So we've got through everything that we wanted to talk about initially. Are there any questions from anyone online that wants to raise that? So Janelle asked, when does this take effect? From the 1st of October 2021. So if you have a look at on the Assured Support website, under the planner, we've outlined most of the regulatory events that are coming up this year, and tried to put them in sequence so that your compliance people, and that might be you, can see everything that's coming down the pipeline, because this is a big piece of work, but it's not the only big piece of work, because you've got complaints, you've got reference checking, you've got a whole heap of things coming down the pipeline at you. So have a look at that planner. We've outlined a lot of things. There's a lot of stuff happening with insurance policies, which we'll add over time, but have a look at that and just see what's coming in. But October is going to be a very busy month for licensees, but you can't wait till October. So you've got to start now to think about those types of things. So,
and you've also got the annual consent process coming into effect as well.
That's right. You've got fee disclosure stuff that kicks in 1 July. You've got to start to get ready for the loss of the claims exemption and to think about whether or not you need that coming through.
So my question was just so that I can be clear, we're coming up for an audit shortly. Do you have the same sort of obligations when it comes to breach reporting in your role as an external compliance service?
No, I don't think so.
So we're not an AFSL?
No, we're not an AFSL or representative of an AFSL, so we don't. But obviously, the issues that we report to the AFSL then become your issue to identify. It'd be really dangerous, I think, that if it's extended to everybody, the auditor, the people who, you know, deliver your station, all those aspects. So no, you don't have to worry about that. There's still a level of confidentiality, and in some cases privilege that protects those relationships anyway.
Yep. Thank you for that. That was a question that I would have been asked.
Normally people ask you about the money. They say, how much are the fines if these things go wrong? But they make it significant. Are there any other questions, guys? Anyone else? Okay, well, what we might do is we might just wrap it up then, because I don't think we've got any other things to talk about. What we've done here, though, is to try to help you out We're giving you some additional, James, yeah, sorry, James, have you got a question? Okay, so when is actually going to get rid of the AFSL layer? Never, and I don't think there's any real advantage in doing that. You think about the systems, processes and resources that are required to actually run a license now, to make sure that clients can be compensated, to make sure that representatives are trained and competent. I think it'd be disastrous to get rid of the AFSL layer, you know, because essentially you've got an unregulated industry. I don't think that will ever happen.
I think the pendulum's swung more to that compliance side at the moment, so I think until it will stay there for a while, and I think that AFSL layer will stay. Interesting question around overcharging a client and refunding them. I mean, I guess that depends on whether it comes under one of the core obligations of being efficient, honest and fair. So if you're overcharging a bunch of clients with very excessive amounts, that might be seen as not.
And also how you found out. Like if you found out because a client brought it to your attention, but there's hundreds of other clients that might also be done, that'll be a really interesting piece. But I think that's not a bad way to remediate it from that perspective. And I think, look, all the research suggests that often by apologising and offering some type of compensation, you can address most issues. So I think that's a really good way of dealing with it. Try to avoid overcharging clients, but mistakes will happen. It comes back to the point we made earlier on. We've all got issues, right? So these things are going to happen. Approach them in good faith, be transparent, and be effective, and things will work out from that perspective as well. So
it is a grey area. I mean, maybe it's just a one-off and it's accidentally occurred and you've refunded them and you've done everything you need to do. So from that perspective, it wouldn't be reportable at all.
Yeah. And if you're running a good business, you don't have anything to worry about, right? So it's just, as a licensee, the same as an advisor, there's an obligation to act in a professional manner, and this is one of the things to bear in mind from that perspective. Again, I don't think I know there's a lot of alarmism about it. I don't think it's as bad as people are speculating. I think good businesses will implement this quite easily. Just don't leave it to the last minute. Okay, don't leave it until 30th of September to do, because there's more involved. And the capability and competence of your compliance people, whatever you call them, whether RMs or whatever those people are, make sure you've got the right people in your equipment to do the right job. What we've done there in that further resources slide, we've given you a couple of articles or resources we think which would help you. What I suggest you look at that, the 2021 action plan. Again, that's replicated in the planner, but it would be really helpful to just run through that. But also management and consequence management, which looks at the whole issue about consequence management, which brings together your monitoring and supervision and your complaints and all those bits and pieces, and gives you a framework, consistent framework to deal with these things, which is absolutely consistent with the breach reporting. Like I said, we're going to put out an article next week that's going to run through some penalty provisions and give you a bit more guidance. The draft regulations came out yesterday, so we'll also provide more information on that as time goes on. If there are no further questions and nothing else has come through the chat, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you, Tori, for helping us get through this issue. And you'll get a brief survey after this, and you'll get the presentation itself. So again, if you've got any questions, by all means, hit us up and we're happy to help. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks, guys. See ya. Bye.